right, welcome back to Pop Culture Conversations. This is going to be episode 1 of Pop Culture Vibrations. We're gonna start a series where we're gonna talk about different musicians, music bands, maybe concerts, stories about old interactions in the music industry, and things that have influenced us, both Doc, myself, and Bone in the music industry. And I had a topic I wanted to talk about. There's 2 individuals from the music industry that really had a big influence on me when I was younger. I was really into heavy metal and thrash, and it was really getting repetitive where everything started sounding the same, and all the music that was out was kind of redundant and repetitive. And it was like everybody was copying everybody else, and there was nothing new. And I heard, it was the days of MTV, and I heard Soundgarden for the first time. And I was like blown away. And then before you know it, Alice in Chains hits the waves, and you got Nirvana, and you've got all these other bands that come trickling out then. And I was fortunate enough early on to meet Alice in Chains, the band, on their first tour. Met them in a record store, got to talk to them, got their autographs, whole deal. And immediately I was torn between Lane Staley and Chris Cornell. And these are 2 musicians and singers that I think we can all 3 agree are just massively influential vocal talents and generational talents, and have really changed the face of music with what they left on the music industry before they both passed. Would you guys agree?
I would agree on 2 of the points. On one of the points, I just don't know enough.
What are the 2 points you agree with?
I would agree that they are generational talents. I don't remember the other. There was the point that I didn't agree on is that I don't know how influential they are, because I don't know how because they're so generational. I don't know how you would. I'm a musician, and I don't know how you would be influenced by those 2. You know,
all right. Fair.
You don't know how you would be able to tell how influential they are.
Say again?
You don't know how you'd be able to tell how influential they are.
Yeah.
I think that, I don't want to go too off in the weeds. I think that argument could be made at this point, considering what some music really has turned into at this point, and rock and roll isn't the level that it once was. But overall, at least if you're talking about influential to the genre of rock, or anything that deals really with guitar music that isn't pop or hip hop, and even some of pop, I would agree.
I just remembered that there were bands that started to sound like Lane. Yes, I would have to agree. I'll agree on it.
Really, the question would be how influential do you think grunge was? Because that's really came from them. So if you think grunge overall was very influential in the music world,
I would say that it is. I don't like to use that word because what does that mean? I mean that word has been used.
You'd have to be a historian to really know how influential they are.
No, I just think that to me it's like there's not something so different about it that it doesn't fit alongside of Led Zeppelin or Jimi Hendrix. It's like it's just the same stuff. It's just done a little bit differently.
So I watched this documentary not too long ago. The documentary was about thrash, and it was talking about the creation with Metallica and Megadeth and Anthrax and Slayer, and how the Big Four, and they came out of the San Francisco, LA, and New York area, and they really kind of became the influence for that whole different style, a heavier sound of music. And there was an interesting piece in there where they were interviewing Scott Ian, the guitarist from Anthrax. And Scott Ian's like, man, we had like this, we were on top of it, and we were there. He's like, but we're on Monsters, we're on this tour. Because 3 of them ended up on tour in 1987, 88. Yeah. And that was Anthrax, Megadeth, and Slayer.
Was that the Monsters of Rock?
Clash of the Titans tour.
Clash of the Titans.
And it was, this was like, Slayer was on tour for Seasons of the Abyss. Megadeth was on tour for Rest in Peace with Holy Wars, and Anthrax was touring for State of Euphoria, arguably 3 of their best albums. And the Rest in Peace, one of the top 10 heavy metal albums of all time by most people's accounting.
That was a great album.
So, and originally a band called Death Angel was supposed to open, and they were having issues. Somebody was sick. They couldn't open. So they had to dip off the tour. So Alice in Chains gets put on the tour. And Scott Ian talks about this in this documentary. He's like, little did we know. Here's this band opening for us, getting booed at venues and stuff thrown at them at venues. He's like, these guys were professional. They got on stage. They played their music. They did their thing. And who knew that 6 months later, after the tour, Man the Box would drop and they would be bigger than all of us. And they would blow us all away. And it would just open the door. And shortly after that, you have Nevermind by Nirvana, their second album hits, and Bad Motor Finger drops. And you figure grunge comes in and starts taking over the music industry.
Yeah. So what do you think? I think authenticity was the thing that really killed the heavy metal of the late 80s. And that's what the Seattle sound and even a lot of the thrash bands that you mentioned, they had some theatrics with Slayer and Megadeth and Metallica and even Anthrax. But no one could say that Kurt Cobain was not authentic for whatever it was that he believed. And any of them.
And I will tell you, I thought about this earlier today before we had this planned. So the thing with the thrash, that whole genre of music, was a little known fact outside of people that are really invested or that were really involved in the scene when it was going on, is the fact that most of those bands, the music industry came in and moved members around to other bands. So the bands weren't even the bands they were to begin with. And there was a whole dynamic lost. And a couple of the bands, they got put into the state, but they never recovered. They never got to, they capped at a certain point where when you look at the Seattle and the grunge side of things, the bands that came out of there, the ones in the beginning, the Fluid, the Afghan Wigs, Mudhoney, Mother Love Bone, Alice in Chains, Nirvana, and Soundgarden, nobody messed with those bands. They were what they were, and they were put out as they were. It wasn't until guys started dying, like Andrew Wood died, and you had the Temple of the Dog project where Eddie Vedder joined Mother Love Bone, and it becomes Pearl Jam, and you start having the members of these bands start messing with each other and doing really interesting things together, and that's leading to the topic of this conversation. But did you have anything to add right now, Doc? Any questions? Because I know that we're a little out of your element.
What was that? The one you said that turned into Pearl? I didn't catch where you said that.
So there was a band.
The one that turned into Pearl Jam. What was that? What was the name?
Mother Love Bone.
So there was a band called Mother Love Bone, and they were
actually really quickly. Actually, the one question I had was, what I know Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains. What was the fourth band? Because wasn't it 4 bands? That was the Seattle sound.
So it's more than 4, but it's Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, and technically it was Mother Love Bone. Those are the 4 that started it, but you also had Mudhoney, Screaming Trees, the Afghan Wigs, and the Fluid. There were 8 of them.
Right, but the answer you're looking for is Pearl Jam.
Pearl Jam is what would it be? What Mother Love Bone became. So basically, you had Mother Love Bone was a band that Andrew Wood was the singer, and they were just a different kind of band. And in Seattle, they were Alice in Chains opened for them, Soundgarden. All these guys were friends. They did all this stuff together. And when Andrew Wood overdosed and died, it really left a mark on that whole deal. And Chris Cornell, he felt a certain kind of way about it and decided he was going to do a album. He wanted to do a tribute album, but he didn't want it to be a Soundgarden album. So he had, I think it's just the drummer from Soundgarden and him did this Temple of the Dog album. And the word Temple of the Dog came from a song called Man of Golden Words by Mother Love Bone, where they say, I'm just living in the Temple of the Dog in the song. And it turns out that Stone Gossard and Mike McCready of Mother Love Bone end up coming and playing on the album. And hence, these guys, Eddie Vedder is apparently at the time the roommate of Chris Cornell, brings them on, he does the 2 songs, Pearl Jam is born.
I thought that, I had heard that Anthony Kiedis had given Eddie Vedder a cassette tape because he was friends with Jack Irons, because Jack Irons was in the Chili Peppers. And Jack Irons also was in Seattle at the time and knew that Pearl Jam was looking for a singer, but I wasn't aware that they were roommates. Is there any truth to that story?
I don't know, but I've heard that story retold on multiple platforms.
It's interesting. It's difficult to try to prove some of these things. Now, to the point of influence, do you think, because you probably heard a lot more modern stuff than I've heard, Do you think that because I mean, you have an analytical mind, you have a discerning ear. Do you think that those bands have influenced the stuff that's going on today?
The question is, what's going on today? I think by the and correct me if I'm wrong here, but that is where grunge came from, right? The Seattle sound is the foundation of grunge. Yes. There's a lot of bands that come from grunge. They have that claim grunge, and so just from that, I would say there's obviously a big influence because there's a lot of bands that have, and they obviously, you know, because bands change over time and bands morph, and the sound isn't always necessarily the same because it's unique when you have different people. But there's a lot that came from that, and I think there is a whole generation that were introduced to those groups, and from those groups, they're musicians now, and the majority of them, I think they would have had a massive influence. Even, you know, because I think there's the aspect of it that isn't necessarily I want to say is kind of subconscious, but I think they call it it's not, it's like I can't think of the word, but when you're experiencing something like, and it goes into you and then it comes out basically. And so it's like in their music, even if it wasn't consciously going, I want to sing like so-and-so, or I want to play like so-and-so, if they like that sound and they were introduced that sound, that affects their taste. And as they're going, cause honestly, like as a musician myself, right. When I was playing guitar, right, you know what sounds great, but what sounds great comes from your likes, your taste.
Yes.
So when you discover a thing, you go, oh, that sounds a lot like this thing in this other song. And so if your taste is this thing here, you're going to kind of follow along that pattern of that thing that taste of music that you like. So if you're into funk, you're going to like the sounds that sound like funk when you're playing guitar. And so you're going to slowly go into funk. And then in the same sort of aspect, because I think that grunge is sort of a new style of, it becomes this new style, its own style of music. At least subgenre, I would say genre. And you know, when people are learning how to play an instrument, they pick a style. They have styles that they like the most. Someone likes jazz, they learn how to play jazz. Someone likes, you know, rock. Someone likes grunge. Someone likes funk. Someone likes a pop kind of sound. They learn how to make that music. So all of that ties in to say that when you have a sound like that originates, it's very original, or it's original-esque. How original is anything? And it has that big explosion. It's impossible to say it doesn't have a giant influence.
No, I don't think it is possible because it is a fact that it does.
So
it was just difficult to remember.
It's interesting when you look at bands, because certain bands get to a size where they are really big, and sometimes you have musical differences, and bands will split up.
Oh, hold on 1 second. The word I was looking for was epigenetic.
Epigenetic,
which is how things go in your genes that aren't genetic. They don't come from. They go in your genes from external things you're experiencing.
It's the surface genealogy.
People, just like children can be adopted by parents. They're not related to them genetically, but they develop epigenetic things by living with them. They develop things from them. They acquire things from them, epigenetic traits from them, even though they have no blood relatives. That's the word I was looking for.
Oh, that was a big word.
I feel smart now.
Doc comes with some big words. That's why he's the doc. So
I'm reading a lot of medical texts lately.
I don't want to get out of the grunge thing, but I want to use an example because I want to segue into this last segment of this before we close this part out. So you have bands that get really popular, and I would say that Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Alice in Chains are three bands that got really popular.
I believe Pearl Jam was pretty huge too.
Pearl Jam's still pretty huge because of the bands we're speaking of. Eddie's still alive and they still tour. So, but if you look at a band, just using regular rock as an example, look at Van Halen. Van Halen at the time was one of the bigger mainstream rock bands that was around with David Lee Roth. David Lee Roth kind of gets in the falling out with Eddie and the Van Halen brothers. It gets out. Sammy Hagar comes in, and he never really recovered in that band. He has done some reunion stuff with them, but he went on to create his own band on the side, the David Lee Roth band, where he pretty much put what you would call a super group together with the musicians that he assembled, with Billy Sheehan and Steve Vai, and went and toured with that. So the point now is, the Lane Staley, Chris Cornell, these two are two guys that on my radar, I have trouble discerning which one I think I like more. And I tell you that they are both so different, but at the same time in the same genre of music, and they're contemporaries of each other. And Lane, while being in rehab at one point, formed a secondary band in rehab with members of some other bands, Mudhoney, Mudhoney, him, the Afghan Wigs, and was it McCready? Was Mike McCready in that too?
Know.
I think it was Mike McCready. I think it's Mike McCready and him. It's and two other guys, one from Mudhoney and somewhere else. Well, anyway, so it was kind of like a super group that they were going to continue doing, but he ended up relapsing and ODing and dying before they could do a second album. Well, on the second, between the first and second album of Alice in Chains, the first album is Facelift. The second album was Dirt. They had an EP that came out in between called Sap. It had like 5 or 6 tracks on it. And the last track on the album is called Right Turn. And that song, it's interesting because it gives all the Alice in Chains members, it's Jerry Cantrell and Mike Starr and Lane get credit for all the writing on these songs. But when it gets to that last track, the track is given
Alice Mudgarden
to a band called Alice Mudgarden. And Alice Mudgarden was a band that recorded one song and had plans to create a supergroup to move on, which got shelved. And looking back, it would have been pretty insane. So, Bone, tell me what you know about Alice Mudgarden.
I know basically everything that you just said, except for I did notice that it said Alice Mudgarden at the end, and I do know that Chris Cornell is in that song.
Yes.
But so I don't know much about it. But there's an angle that you're heading towards. I'm eager to hear it.
So it's the what could have been angle. So aside from that one track on that album, that EP of them on there, and if you listen to that track, they're kind of all stepping all over each other in that song. And it's called Alice Mudgarden because it's Alice in Chains with Chris Cornell of Soundgarden and Mark Arms of Mudhoney, the lead singer of Mudhoney. And the 3 singers are just doing their own thing in there. The first half of the song is Lane, and then the second half, toward the closing of the song, is all 3 of them just all over each other. And they had plans. The 3 of them were talking about plans of actually doing a group where they would be in a group together.
That would have been interesting.
And I look at it where you have all these different musicians that team up to do bands and do things, but there were always this player and this player with this vocalist, and now you had 3 vocalists that were planning on doing something.
I think that's interesting because if you look back in the 60s, there wasn't a lot of that. I mean, you had Clapton play with the Beatles, but you didn't see Jimmy Page playing with, Mott the Hoople or whoever. It's like there were, even when Eddie Van Halen played on Michael Jackson stuff, it was uncredited. And so it's like there's so many opportunities there could have been to make really cool music. I mean, you take a stab in the dark. It might suck, but you know what I mean?
And you look at the people that we'll take the next couple minutes, then we'll wrap up. The people in that genre that have gone. You had Kurt Cobain, killed himself. Lane overdosed. You had Cornell overdosed medication. Some people think it was suicide. Who knows which way it was. Andrew Wood, lead singer of Mother Love Bone, overdosed.
To me,
that's like the amount, and it's like an entire, with the exception of Eddie Vedder. And when you look at it, yeah, Alice in Chains continued with a new member that co-sings with Jerry. Soundgarden just stopped. Audioslave was over, and they went back to being Rage Against the Machine. And then if you look at Nirvana, Chris Novacek was just like, well, we're done. And Dave Grohl went on to do Foo Fighters and refuses to play any Nirvana songs live. He won't do it. And he's like, that was a different time in my life.
Well,
it was something. This is where I'm at now, and I respect it. But it's like, it's just it's like.
But I think that's the sad part about being so creative and so talented, is it generally comes with a sacrifice. It comes with a cost, and you can't be generally you can't be someone with such abilities and such a creative mind and not have your demons. And
That's so true.
And that's the sad part. So, all of these people, who and specifically at a time where, things are a little bit different now, as we've pushed the importance of mental health. We've pushed the importance of these aspects. And there's a whole history that there's a lot you can go into. There's a whole history there about the epidemic that the heroin epidemic and all of that and where that came from. And that's a whole crazy history there too. But that we've kind of moved away an aspect past. So it was easier for these people. And then the other side of when you're young too. You're young and you're just kind of blowing up, and it's difficult to, it's a thing you've never experienced. And even in general, even for people who aren't famous, and they're when they're growing through a certain time in their life, it's difficult even to cope and understand what you're going through.
Well, I think it's interesting. Growing up in the 70s, right? We were just left to do whatever, go out, be home by dark. That was it. It was that freedom that we had, which was the attitude. Because look, me personally, I was terrified of heroin. That was terrified to. I never I couldn't do it. But a lot of my friends that I grew up with, and there were other things that I was more crazy about, and so there was a freedom and a craziness and like a willingness to try stuff. And then there's somewhat of a distance between, like, I think in every generation, there's a distance between the generation before you and the current generation. And there's probably still,
I think it's like also there's a generation that has taught the next generation, not to do that. Because honestly, I think this whole generation here, even though, because there are aspects, because for a long time, like there was a point in time when heroin was legal in this country, and that was a long time ago, but there were opium dens and it was perfectly legal. It was perfectly fine.
Right next to laudanum on the show.
Yeah. So but this, I think, because realistically, I think this whole generation came up, and this time there's a lot of that, not kind of rebelling against authority and all that kind of push, but kind of came up and the reaction is the similar reaction. Well, is it really that bad? But now, as they've all lived out their life, a chunk of their life, they've kind of shown that it is bad. It's bad. Heroin's bad. And so next generation, that lesson has been established. You know what I mean? Because that lesson has been established. I don't think there's as many. I mean, we're into a lot of, there's a lot of crazy things this next generation is going into. But that's why it's kind of got a little more under control, the heroin specific side of it. Because I think that a lot of that has kind of played itself out.
I will tell you that the upbringing I had, my mom and dad were like, they were the type of people that if you wanted to do something, they wanted you to do it at home. And it was generally alcohol. I had zero interest in doing any kind of drug. And especially anything like heroin or cocaine or all the different other names you had for the stuff. And to be honest, most of the heroin and that kind of stuff, I'm truly in the dark on it. Outside of knowing that heroin or horse or whatever they call all the different names. But most of I acknowledge that there were opium dens, but did I know that? And I know that opium is where heroin comes from, but I'm not
talking about when I said mention opium dens, I'm talking long. I'm talking before your time.
Well, I understand that.
Right.
Legal. But I also understand that I'm also trying to tell you that aside from knowing that they shoot it up in a vein and beyond that,
well, that's what I think. What's interesting is that culturally, or at least maybe it's a regional thing. Maybe it has to do with morals that are passed down genetically. I don't know, but for whatever reason, right? I was terrified of that shit, and I didn't do it. But I think what's interesting is you were talking earlier is that because we had the opiate epidemic, it's still going on. And now people, because they can't get the pills that they're hooked on, then they started going to which drives the heroin market, which is another bizarre thing. But I think, that these are all very interesting questions that we're going to be covering in pop culture.
We are kind of getting way off topic, but
yeah, we got into that topic because that's so many of the people in the grunge Seattle sound, and just just to close that part, what of the bands in that range, which is the one that you think? Now I understand that you might not have one, but which one impacted you the most?
Impacted you the most, or had the most impact?
Most
You
had the
personally?
most impact on you personally. Like which one do you? I'm not.
Can I answer it this way? I think the best album to come out of those four bands is Dirt, and I would say the second best is probably Sap, which was not an album. But I would say that Kurt Cobain over the long term has had more of an influence on me because I'm not a very, more of a simple musician, and it's just what I do what I can do, and so I feel like I've been able to understand more of what he does on as far as breaking down his style and understanding how he does it, and so and I just want to say that of all of those bands, which I appreciate some of their stuff, the authenticity is really the main selling point.
I personally was a giant Chris Cornell fan. Am a giant Chris Cornell fan, and so I love all of the work he did. I mean, I love all of it, but for me personally, out of all of them, I just loved all the work he did the most. Impact wise, like that's harder because there's like impact wise, I don't know. That's a little harder because they're all like have really really great songs that kind of touch you. But overall, I found that I really enjoyed Chris Cornell's abilities and his talent more. There's a lot more of his songs that I was really into. Like there's a giant list of songs that he did, and there's a couple, and I haven't listened to I probably haven't come across all of the songs from the other ones, but I've come across a few of them. And
did you ever listen to Dirt?
The album like completely
from Alice in Chains, yeah.
I don't think I listened the whole album. I've listened to
I wonder.
some of
Let me ask you a question.
the names from it.
So you never bought a whole album in your life, have you?
Never in my life.
And that to me is an interesting thing because hearing an album versus hearing that's something I don't understand. I really I've kind of been out of the loop for a while. But so you answer your own question.
So Nirvana was a band that I really liked, but Kurt was somebody that I appreciated as more of like a garage sound style. It was more like just raw and in your face. And after they got signed to Geffen and Nevermind came out, they were very produced. I really liked the music and I love Kurt, but he did not have the same impact on me as the others. And vocally, I don't put him in the same category as Lane or Cornell. And I think Andrew Wood was a better vocalist than Cornell, than Cobain. It's just everything went right for Nirvana. They were everything was hitting perfectly. They were produced properly. I liked their lyrics, their music, and it was just out there enough and real and authentic that it was just different. But for me, I'm like I said at the beginning of this, I'm brutally torn between Cornell and Lane, and I would probably say that the Temple of the Dog album was the album for me, and that gives me a little edge with Cornell because of why he wrote it and the irony behind it, and then he ended up dying from the same shit they killed the other two. But that Temple of the Dog album is just so it hits me in the feels every time I listen to it.
I only listen. There's only a couple songs on it that I'm see. It's like back in the day, I was somewhat narrow-minded musically, yeah. And so there was things, but I just think that maybe how vocally I was about it, because if I didn't like something, I didn't like it, and so I really only liked Dirt and Facelift. They're dramatically different, but I didn't like really anything after those.
So the album,
and the same thing with the Soundgarden. Bad Motorfinger was an incredible album, and then I liked a couple songs off of the next one, Super Unknown, and then there was stuff from Chris Cornell that came out that I heard that I thought was incredible, and you can't diminish the guy's talent just because I didn't appreciate it. It's just some things strike you, and some things have meaning for you, and some things don't, and so it's not an attack on someone.
Lane, Facelift, Sap, Dirt, and then the self-titled album, and an unplugged album, and a live album, and then he was
Jar of Flies.
Then he was dead. A Jar of Flies, and then you had the Mad Season collaboration with McCready and the guys from Mudhoney and a few other bands. And that album, personally, the Mad Season album, it's probably better than all of the Alice in Chains stuff.
Well, you know,
Now, but I love
That's subjective.
But I love Jerry
no, I mean,
Cantrell.
yeah, that's his.
I
he's
love
allowed
Jerry
that.
Cantrell's guitar, and I love the harmonies they do in Alice
Oh,
in
yeah.
Chains.
Hell yeah.
But Mad Season was just so completely on a different level, and it was like there's songs like Life Less Dead and Above, and anyway, this is getting too long.
Yeah. We
I
will
wanna-
close it out there.
Yeah, we'll close it out there. Thank you for tuning in. We're gonna, if you could comment below this video when it gets posted, let us know what you thought. Which of these singers that went too soon in the grunge era that you liked, and the bands we talked about, which ones were your favorite and what you liked, and then let us know about, as we carry this music series forward, is there musicians or bands or concert sets or what is it? Was it a particular instrument? What is it that you like and that you want to hear us talk about? And then I'm going to hand it back over to Doc.
Yeah, you started this episode. Well, I just want to say all the stuff that you said. Great, thanks. Thanks for being on the show tonight, kids. Like, subscribe. You know.
Bone out.